So this is a GCSE video on the skeletal system, doing it slightly differently today. I'm using an app called Google Expeditions, which is free. It looks a little bit like this. When you're in Google Expeditions, you can discover AR or VR. So let's start with AR. AR stands for Augmented Reality, and that brings models learning into the room with you. And VR is virtual reality, which is useful to have a set of goggles to do that. So we're going to use the Augmented Reality app today, and you can see that in my library down here I've already got the skeletal system stored. So it allows you to view it in AR, which is what I want to do. Once I tap this, it will come up with some little dots, and you'll feature this a focus spot in the room. You'll tap the screen, and sure enough it brings the skeletal system or the skeleton into the room with us. So I'll try and get my finger in here so you can see where I'm pointing to, and I can actually interact with the model, which is pretty cool. So this is the cranium, this is our skull, so you need to call it the cranium in a GCSE exam. Then you can see we've got our spinal cord, our vertebrae at the back, full of irregular bones. And then looking at the front of the skeletal system here, or the skeleton, we've got our two clavicles, which are collarbone. And you can see the rib cage situated behind those, slightly below, and then obviously you've got the sternum at the front, and we can get a side-on view of that in just a second. There we go, so that's the sternum at the front of the rib cage. Here, this long bone here is our humerus, and located at the back of that flat kind of bone is the scapula. Then we've got our radius and our ulna. We have our pelvic girdle. You can see our coccyx point at the bottom of the spine. And we've got this massive long bone here, which is known as the femur. We can see our patella, which is a kneecap, and we've got tibia and fibula. Not to forget, if we zoom in on the fingers here, sometimes it goes a little bit funky. There we go. Let's just stop that. And we'll just hold it there. You can see the finger bones there. So in order, we've got the carpals, metacarpals and phalanges. And if we just go down to the feet, in the same order, you can see we've got the tarsals, metatarsals and phalanges there as well. So the cool thing about this app is you can kind of interact with it. You can move around the skeleton. You can see it from different angles, different perspectives. What we're going to do is we're going to scroll these tabs along. We'll have a quick look at the skull. This is quite a cool little feature. Let's bring the skull into the room, and you can see that will just join together, and that protects the brain. So the function of the skull is to protect the brain. The spinal cord is complex, but there's 5 aspects you need to know about in GCSE, and we're going to look at those in a little bit more detail. So at the top we've got the cervical, so they are irregular bones. If you look up close you can see those irregular notches on them. So we've got our cervical, thoracic. The way I always remember that is come to Legends sports class. So we've got cervical, thoracic, lumbar, sacrum and coccyx, and the coccyx is that tiny little bone at the bottom there that you can see is slightly detached from the bottom of the spinal cord. If we scroll across again, we're going to look at the different types of bones, and you know from a previous video that we did, there are 4 different types of bones. This one here is a long bone, longest bone in the body, femur, humerus. You can see that we've got an irregular bone, so that's, it's disappeared. That's one of the spinal cords that we just looked at, one of the vertebrae I should say. We've got a flat bone, and we have short bones as well. If we look inside a bone, quite interesting little living organism here. Look. So we look inside the bone and just hit this little tab. It gives us some really useful information. So bones are living tissues. They contain within the matrix of proteins and minerals. The main protein found with the bone is collagen, and this plays a large part in the strength of the bone. Bone development is called ossification, and that's a name or a word you need to know for GCSE. There are 3 types of minerals found within bones, and they are magnesium, phosphorus and calcium. So I'll just tap that down. And the last one is we're going to look at different types of bone fractures, which you also need to know for your GCSE exam. So this looks a little bit like Stonehenge, the 5 types of fracture. We'll start with the most gory and sort of grotesque one, which is this type of fracture here. This has 2 different types of names. Essentially, this one here is called an oblique or a displaced fracture. You can see the bone is displaced, and then that red stuff is supposed to simulate skin, and you can see the bone has actually popped out the skin. It's quite a serious one. Sometimes jockeys falling off their horses, motocross. This can be an impact injury, be quite serious. The one to the left, so I'll try and put my finger in and point to this one. It's not that easy to do using this app, but this one here that's broken into 4 different pieces. That type of break is called a communicative fracture, where it's smashed into loads of little pieces. Surgeon's nightmare, they have to put all that back together. And the one at the back, located over here, it's a horrible, horrible little type of injury. I'll see if I can just zoom in on that. It's called a green stick fracture, and you see where that red aspect is there? What actually happens is that the bone doesn't entirely break, it just shards, and all those little shards of bone, they stick into your flesh and they kind of aggravate the ligaments and the flesh around it. So they're not a particularly nice one to deal with whatsoever. Then we've got a transverse fracture, which is this one, often called a nice clean break, this one where it's broken into two. And that they pin that back together and away they go. And then the last type of fracture you can see here is where one's broken off slightly, okay? And that can be caused by something called a stress fracture, where it's just snapped off the bottom. So they're your types of fractures, and that completes the AR video on the skeletal system. Again, if you're looking to find this in your apps, just go to Google Expeditions, and if you go into the library and discover it, you can search tools, you can put things like skeletal system in there. So I'll just pop that in there, skeletal system, and you can download that onto your apps.